Hello and welcome to the Architecting Tech podcast, a show for down-to-earth conversations about what's happening in the field with organizations testing, experimenting with, and deploying generative AI applications. Today, I'm joined by a special guest, a solutions architect, Justin Mueller, who I've had the pleasure to work with a little bit here and there, and mostly got turned on to Justin via a blog that I saw socializing around on the internet a couple weeks ago about prompt decomposition. We're going to talk about prompt decomposition, getting applications to production, and more. But first, Justin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Justin Mueller. I'm a generative AI solution architect specialist. Been working in natural language processing for about 14 years and generative AI for about 3 years. So my first published workshop on when I joined AWS was in partnership with this small little open source company no one had heard of called OpenAI, and they had just launched their GPT-2 model. So we had a fine-tuning workshop on that. So I've been working Gen AI for a little while, and our specialist team is really focused on customers who are already past a POC stage. They've already explored Gen AI a little bit, and maybe they've done some tests and they're looking to scale it out. So we help kind of bridge that gap and understanding how to push things into larger scale production. And unfortunately, we also help customers where maybe there's a bit of a fire drill going on and something has gone wrong, and they need a specialist to pop in and help. And excited to talk about prompt decomposition today because that particular topic comes up in both of those scenarios and has been really helpful for customers, either fixing things when they need to be get out of a hole or planning on how they're going to scale out.
Well, I tell you what, already I'm like, okay, my ears are open. I did not know we were talking to a real AI OG working on fine-tuning GPT-2 model. So you've really, like, you can really say you've been in generative AI for 3 years. Like, most of the time when somebody says that to me, I'm like, yeah, sure, you've been in it since ChatGPT came out. But you've actually been in it before it was cool. Verified here first, folks. And that's great. I mean, I bet your team's getting a lot of asks right now based on what you described there of, like, customers that have experimented and are now focusing on getting past that testing phase into production, because at least a lot of the organizations I'm working with spent a lot of last year testing and now are at that kind of point where they're like, okay, we've written some code, we've tried a few use cases, we've launched a couple of things internally, but we really want to look at launching something like big or one of our top line Gen AI projects. So I'd love, before we get into the nitty gritty, I'd love to hear, like, what's your view been of how customers are starting to experiment and adopt these things over the last, let's call it last year and a half, because I know that's when the investment from customers really seems to have accelerated.
Yeah, that's fair. I can tell you when I did my GPT-2 workshop, we were hoping that anybody would show up.
Yeah.
So it was not quite as exciting back then. But one of the nice things about being on our particular team and being scoped to North America, we work with customers across all industries and all sizes of customers. And I've seen some really big trends. You're certainly right. Last year there was a lot of POCs. And I think the two kind of big important trends that I've seen is that, one, there are more people moving to production and finding real value from Gen AI. And that's linked to two, which is there's fewer chatbots going on. I think because ChatGPT kind of kicked off this Gen AI craze, the natural inclination for a lot of customers were like, Gen AI is a chatbot, and so if I want to do Gen AI, I need to do a chatbot too. And what's happened over the last, I think, 12 to 18 months is some of the other types of use cases are being explored, and critically, use cases that have much clearer ROI. Sometimes it can be very hard to calculate, like, what's my bump in revenue if I have a chatbot on my help page? Well, it's probably nothing. I don't know. I mean, or maybe a little bit, 5%, right? But there's other places, especially in ETL tasks, where the ROI is very easy to calculate and is in the orders of like 100x or even higher.
Yeah. No, I think anecdotally, I mean, I think you've seen more customers than I have, but just anecdotally, I feel like I've seen a lot of the similar trends in that. Particularly, I think one area, and I'll be interested to get your opinion on it too, that excites me is I have customers coming to me a lot with, since the emergence of multimodal capabilities of these models, a lot of vision use cases, which I find fascinating in that and how my customers are trying to apply it in the back office. So, like, I work in financial services, and of course all these organizations are sitting on documents, images, scans of IDs, and all these validation points that they've gotten from customers, and you could extrapolate many other forms of documentation. But I like that. Like that was the first use case I latched onto. I'm like, okay, this isn't a chat bot, but there's a very if we can make it work, there's very clear, measurable ROI of processing these documents that humans used to process or that you used to not process well with your previous technology stack. But do you have any example outside of the chatbots? Because I know everybody's heard of these use cases. What are some of the use cases that you've seen that you said have had that really high business value? Because I feel like that's oftentimes when I'm working with customers, what I'm seeking is what is the use case that is going to have real high ROI? So that way, all this dev time we're going to invest over the next couple of months is
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a couple of really big ones right now. Certainly, IDP has picked up in the
mm-hmm.
last 6 months. So, intelligent document processing, many different forms of that. Anytime where you're paying a huge group of humans to analyze documents, we see huge upticks, right? So, one of the first ones I worked on was a case where a financial company was required to do fraud auditing, and so they had these high paid financial analysts that would get printed out a packet of 250 pages of all of the different accounts and transactions on lines and all these things. And they would sit there for 2 or 3 days and read through the packet and decide if it was fraud or not. Right. And so literally just dump that into a single call to an LLM, and it would give you a report. We think this is fraud, and here's why, and I cited the sources. And so now the financial analysts read through that packet, and in 30 to 45 minutes, they can analyze for fraud. And I think the really cool piece of that use case. So first of all, they said, okay, well, we went from 3 days to 30 to 45 minutes, and we know how much those people are getting paid. So that's instant savings. But the cool part about that was they said, well, most of the time, Claude was the model they were using for this. Claude is getting the analysis right. What they used to do, because that was the best they could afford, was they would check for fraud on a random number of accounts about once a month. And so most of their customers were never audited for fraud. And now they said, well, with Claude, we can audit all of our customers every 5 minutes or every 30 minutes. And so it's not only a massive cost savings, but it's a new feature of a new capability they couldn't do without GenAI.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I wonder too with that use case is do you find, because ROI is I feel like everybody says it so much, but I love when we're getting specific of okay, the ROI here is human time saved calculated by hours saved based on the FTE cost of an employee or whatever. What are some other ROI, has the ROI you've run into for these use cases mostly been around productivity, or have you uncovered any others that we're able to show kind of clear ROI without just being hours saved or time saved? Or maybe quality improvements. I don't know.
Well, I think that the way that ROI is calculated changes from customer to customer. I'll give you a different
Totally.
example that's similar, which is one of our customers has a large file hosting service, and so customers can save different types of files. And the customer that we're working with is the search team inside of the customer. And the search team, they essentially were doing keyword searches. They were doing some semantic searching. But many of the files were either images or graphs, and essentially you couldn't really search for those unless you knew the file name, right? And so they ran an ETL task that they basically passed all those images to Claude and said, "What is this? Just give me a description of it." And that tag, that text that Claude generated, became a tag that was searchable. So now their users had a kind of a new capability to actually find their stuff, right, where it was just unsearchable before. And so part of how they, I mean, in some sense it's a new feature, but part of how they calculate the impact of that is how often when people come to searches do they actually use their search results, right? And so they have a metric for people searching and then just leaving the page frustrated versus actually clicking into results. So it's not as clear of a time save or a money save, but it's the metric of success for that group.
Totally right. In that case, it's a customer experience sort of, but still very, very measurable. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll move on from ROI because sometimes my I feel like if you say that word too many times in a conversation, people are just start okay, you've said ROI too many times, you're full of it. But no, honestly, that's I'm seeing similar if most of the ROIs I'm calculating are time saved. There's this one interesting area before we move on to maybe some of the things that you see getting to production where like there it's like there are some mini Gen AI applications. I would use a developer assistant as an example, where it's like you see metrics like amount of code that's been committed to a repo or something like this that like is a kind of proxy for improved productivity. But sometimes it's like you have these applications where it makes a worker feel more productive, and maybe they are more productive, by the way, also. But it's just like really hard to measure. And when I think about these use cases, I kind of go back to like maybe this is what it was like when back before like Microsoft Excel, when people used to like write down and do calculations in like a matrix on a piece of paper, and then we gave them Excel, like we knew that was going to help make people more productive because they could move more quickly and do calculations in a piece of software. But like, were we really measuring the ROI for that when we were rolling out, or did we just have analysts saying, "I need Excel to do my job better"? So anyway, that's one
Well,
thing I'm always interested in is when you have anecdote of people saying this is making me more productive, but maybe you don't have the data to prove it fully.
I don't know if this is helpful. I don't know if it's exactly on the topic you're talking about, but one of my observations about ROI is that from our perspective as a specialist team at AWS, we have a lot of requests to work on a lot of different projects. A lot of customers right now is like, oh, I need to do Gen AI or I need to help with Gen AI. And one of the ways we filter the requests is that if they haven't thought about ROI, that's pretty much a dead ringer that this is not something we're going to help with. But if they've thought about ROI and they're like, oh, we'll get a 5% boost, right? Like, because it's a chatbot, a 5% boost or something, we just shrug our shoulders and say, well, okay, good luck,
Yep,
right? But what we're really
totally.
looking for is places where it's like 100x ROI or something
Mm.
like that, right? And those are the projects that I think are really getting momentum for moving to production because they have a much less controversial impact, and customers are much more excited about those kinds of things.
I honestly, that I think for me personally, that's a very helpful perspective actually, because I feel like I spend so much time. I spend a lot of time working with customers to try to justify the ROI for a project, but just like you, I've seen a couple, like a document processing use case that came across my desk recently, where it was just like very clear from day one. There's just undeniable value if we can make it work, and
Yeah.
it's gotten engagement beyond just the engineering team because the business also sees that. And so I think that that's a great point of like in the fullness of time, there's going to be a lot of use cases that continue to show more ROI, but for right now, even not just for customer like for us, but for customers, like really figuring out and prioritizing aggressively those top use cases, because those a use case like that still takes effort. Like a lot of these use cases take
Sure.
engineering effort to implement. So without that clear ROI, it's is it a learning exercise or what? So okay, I want to talk about what are you seeing launch, and then we'll get into prompt decomposition and maybe how that helps things launch a little bit. But in terms of what's getting to production, like I think of this in two ways. I'm curious how you think of it. I think there is certainly the ROI in the business case. Obviously, there's that part that you need to ensure that you're not wasting your time and that you are aligned with your business. But there's another part of getting to production in my mind that's also like that like let's assume we have good ROI, if it could work. But then there's still a question of like, is this use case technically feasible for generative AI? Will it work at the level of accuracy that's necessary for this type of use case or something like that? So anyway, within that context, I'm just kind of curious what trends you're seeing or what you think help customers on that journey to get something from an idea into like a real high ROI or even just a general production application.
Sure. I mean, it comes in a lot of different forms. One of the common trends I see is that somebody has done a POC, and the accuracy, whatever, however they're measuring accuracy, whatever that means to them, is in the like somewhere between 70 and 90%, right? Or maybe 80 and 90%. And often that means that uh, they're still at the POC stage because that accuracy isn't high enough to justify the use case, and they don't know what to do next, right? They've tried some prompt engineering techniques. Maybe they've tried to clean their source data a little bit, but they're kind of stuck, and are trying to push that last 10%, which is a lot of work. So I think one of the ways that we unlock scale is helping customers push into that 10%. But the other way that we help unlock scale is with metrics, because often when customers put together a POC, it's like a notebook or a quick little project on someone's laptop where it kind of worked locally and I hope it works in production. That's not gonna impress any of your stakeholders that it's ready to go. And so how do you put metrics around it to say this will work in production? I can prove it to you. How do you build trust for your stakeholders to agree that this is something that needs to go forward?
Yeah, that both of those make a lot of sense. I think I will say I'm running into former a lot more than maybe the latter of like, and I hope I run into the latter more of customers that are like, hey, like it's working with, but it's not. And I feel like accuracy is an interesting thing. Like they're actually like people measure their accuracy, but then oftentimes my customers don't have like a clear like we need X% accuracy to feel comfortable launching this. They just know that whatever 70% accuracy they're getting doesn't feel like good enough for their use case, or they've done some risk analysis there. So I want to talk about that piece. I think that leads us into prompt decomposition pretty well. I think so. Before we go into that, on the metric side, like have you seen scenarios that you describe like that where a customer builds something locally, it works locally, and now they're like, okay, cool, I want to scale this, but they had like I'm kind of curious how you take a customer, how you've seen customers go through that journey of like it works locally, now I need to put guardrails on this to prove it to my team.
Yeah.
Because I imagine plenty of people in that position out there, whether they're individual builders or people at AWS working with customers.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I'd say the reason that you are running into the former more than the latter is because you're running into the former more, if that makes sense, which means a lot of times the reason why people can't push that last bit of accuracy is because they don't have the metrics, right? And so what happens is we run into people who say they can't get the accuracy, and what they really mean is I don't have the metrics. Because what the metrics will do is say this part of your solution is working well, this part stinks. And now because we have metrics, we know what to fix, and then we can get the accuracy up. So they're very interrelated. I will say though, it's super common for customers to have an engineering group put together a project. They've tried a couple of prompts, they've tried a couple of things, and they're like, seems good, right? Or I don't know, right? I don't know what is the rigor that you put around that to say, okay, this will go well at scale. And this is actually one of the most interesting thermometers for my group in deciding if we're going to work on a project. Because our group has such limited bandwidth, we only want to commit a resource to a project that we think is going to be successful and have an impact, right? And so the best thermometer that I have is how willing are you to build a test set, right? And so a lot of times when you're doing a POC, you're having fun playing with GenAI, you throw together a few fun prompts and you test them out and you're like, that seems pretty good, right? But if I say, no, I want you to sit down and write down 200 tests, well, that doesn't sound fun. It's like, yeah, it's a bit of work, but if it's a real project and you're willing to invest in it, it's night and day. Having seen walked a lot of customers through this. As soon as I say, well, our next step is to sit down and put together a bunch of test cases, so many customers are like, well, let's talk about a new project.
See, this conversation is the exact type of conversation that I started this podcast for, because I feel like this is where the rubber meets the road type of stuff that many people aren't aware of right now, frankly. And I think that
Yeah.
there's a misconception by and large. And by the way, I'll step back and say probably there are some use cases that are like general purpose use cases where you don't need super rigorous testing, or maybe even use cases where a company might accept the risk. Like an internal use case is an example of that, maybe like an internal RAG, right? I do see customers launching those without feeling like they need to do a lot of testing. I'm not saying they should. I just see those launching still. However, I will say I see a lot more launching, and I'm always curious, like launch versus consumption, right? Because like that's going to be a key indicator in the long
Yeah.
term of like was value delivered. But I guess what I really want to ask here is I know the truth that you're speaking right now, which is that like to get one of these things actually working in production consistently, reliably, in a way that you can confidently speak to it takes real work. You have to write example prompts to test with. There are sometimes like additional techniques in coding that has to go like I'm talking about heavy lifting of application development to make it work and integrate like you need it to. How do you deal with the reality that I think a lot of customers don't know that yet? Like you might be the first person telling a customer that. Maybe
Yeah.
no other vendor has been honest with them and said like, "Hey, this is awesome that you've built this. The next step and how to really prove that this will work is putting in a little bit more effort." Curious how you approach that conversation, because I know I've seen evidence that you're true, what you're saying is true, but I don't always know how to message that to the customer, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, the tried and true method for me is to work backwards from what the customer wants,
Hmm.
right? Because you're right. If I go into a customer and say, "Hey, what you guys need to do is write a bunch of test cases," it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
But if I say, "Well, what
Right.
do you guys need?" "Oh, we need to build stakeholder trust, or we need to make sure that this is going to work in production." I'm like, great, let me help you with the plan for that. Here's the
Yeah.
plan. Step one, build your test cases. And then I actually walk through how do these prove, and I can share examples of times where it's like, well, this test cases, this is what you found, and this is how it works. And so I think working back from like what they're trying to achieve and showing how the test cases help them achieve what they want. So it's about helping them. That's the direction I go in.
Yeah. I feel like, and I like to admit whenever there's things that like my own gap of knowledge may prevent me from doing certain things. I think this is an area where like I could probably improve personally because I'm working with customers a lot, and I know I know there's a gap. I know there's a thing, but I think oftentimes I don't know like these things you're talking about. I don't always know like what do we need to test then to make sure that that
Sure.
accuracy is where it needs to be at scale, or or I guess maybe that's maybe a good question for you. What would you say are maybe the top like broadly? And let's say we're not talking about a specific use case. Maybe we're talking about like an ML platform team or an ops team. Like what are the type of metrics or visibility that you feel teams need to think about in the Gen AI world that maybe they wouldn't have had to think about with traditional ML, or maybe they did and it still applies. But curious what those top few metrics are that tend to move the needle for customers.
Well, certainly accuracy, cost, and latency are the big three in the classic triangle here. But I would say we often start with accuracy with generative AI. More often than not, I see customers that say the main thing that I care about is accuracy. If you get me accuracy, then we can talk about cost and performance. And this trend is actually changing a little bit now because it used to be, I mean, especially if you go back to GPT-2, right? Its accuracy was abysmal, and you had to fine tune it if you wanted any accuracy at all. And even then, it was still like three-fourths of the time you're like, hey, it kind of said something useful. But what's happened now is that models have gotten so good that you can probably get the accuracy you need. And so for the first time now, conversations are shifting a little bit to, well, okay, I can get my accuracy, but can you get it to me at a price point that's available? And I think the tipping point for us at AWS was when Claude 3 launched, where suddenly you had a family of models that could get you the accuracy you needed, but you had different price points. And then you could have a conversation around metrics. But you have to have the metrics there in order to make a good choice.
To me, this is always ever since I kind of started understanding the whole like idea that like with each iteration of model they'll get more intelligent, and I even started this like when I first started playing with RAG as a use case, right? And a lot of RAG use cases, really all you're doing is like retrieving data that already exists and regurgitating it. So like the function of the model is just to comprehend the query. Really, the intelligence of the model doesn't matter a lot. And so as soon as I saw use cases like that, I was like, there is inevitably going to be a shift. And it sounds like you're already seeing some of the shift, where like for certain use cases, customers are thinking much more about cost than intelligence or whatever word we want to call.
Well, let me use that as a springboard to talk about prompt decomposition.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Springboard away, because I really want to dig into. And by the way, everybody, for the folks listening, prompt decomposition. I read a blog from Justin about it. When did you put that blog out? Last month, sometime, maybe early
Yeah.
July or something. And to me, like the first paragraph, the summary of it was like, "There's this technique I've been finding in the field with customers that's helping improve accuracy, helping kind of break down complex problems within the context of the model." And it was such a fascinating read to me because it felt like a lot of these challenges we're talking about of accuracy and scale, it felt like that was a potential solution to many of these things. So I'll
So
admit, all I did was read your blog. I haven't actually implemented prompt decomposition in like a lab yet. So yeah, uh, please, like fire away. Like what do we need to know about prompt decomposition in
yeah.
today?
So and by the way, if anyone's interested, there's that blog does include code, so you can follow along in code and try it out yourself as well. But the basic idea of prompt decomposition is taking a task and decomposing it into its component parts. And this is just part of maybe design theory and how you might want to design a task in the first place. And I actually, especially if I'm able to talk with customers towards the beginning of the ideation process, we start with a flow chart, right? And we say, okay, what do you want your workload to do? Let's draw out a flow chart, right? Here's the customer, they start here. If they talk about the weather, it goes up here. If they talk about sports, it goes down here, and we map out how we want the bot or the process or whatever it is to respond. And now what we do, so what I often see customers doing, which is a huge mistake, is taking that flowchart and just putting it in bullet points into one massive prompt. And you get these Frankenstein prompts. It's like 40,000 tokens.
These are all
And you
my.
read
You're hurting
through it,
my
it's a
feelings,
nightmare.
Justin. These are all of my prompts, man. You're hurting my feelings, dude. It's every prompt I ever wrote.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's where the term prompt decomposition comes from, is take that Frankenstein of a prompt and break it down into its component parts. And what's gonna happen is each one of those steps can be its own prompt or its own piece of code. And what that does is it gives us the there's a lot of different benefits, but it gives us the freedom to look at each piece and decide what's the best tool for this piece. What's the best metrics for this piece? What's the best model for this piece, right? And when we're broken down into a bunch of different pieces and we're collecting metrics from all of those pieces, now when we run the system and we get accuracy, it's not like, well, my system's 90% accurate. It's like, well, this step's 100%, this step's 100%, this step's 20%. Now we're getting to 90%. It's like, okay, that's the piece that we need to change, right? And it lets us zoom in and focus on that. And LLMs, they're non-deterministic. When you have that huge Frankenstein prompts, a lot of times what happens is you change a line, this starts doing something different, some other thing goes weird. When it's decomposed into a bunch of prompts that chain together, now if you change this little prompt, that's the only one that changes because you didn't touch the rest of the system.
Oh, I got a great example. I think maybe folks that have played with Frankenstein prompts like me might have noticed like an interesting behavior in their prompts is like one of the single, at least in my experience, one of the single most important bits of data you put into a prompt is prescribing to the LLM what job it has. And I've seen prompts act completely different, and I've seen accuracy really improve or degrade based on that alone of like telling the model what it is. And so when I first saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, like imagine if I have a complex prompt being able to have different jobs doing different things for each prompt.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
just anecdotally seeing what that can do for one prompt, I could obviously extrapolate and understand how that might help as I'm breaking down prompts because now within one prompt you could have different hats or
Yeah.
different tasks there.
Well, let me share a customer example. And
Yeah.
this was when I first decomposition with a customer. They came to us because they had a long prompt. It was like 20, 30,000 tokens, something like that. And because it's long, almost inevitably it's complicated. You're asking the model to do a bunch of different things. And in this particular instance, they were asking the model to do three different things, and then based on the results of those three things, write a summary of what happened. And the key kind of aha moment for the customer was that prompt was so complicated that they had to run it on a large model like Sonnet, right? Opus wasn't a thing at the time, but because it's complicated, they had to run on Sonnet. If they ran it on Haiku, Haiku didn't have the intelligence to work through all this complicated stuff, right? But running it, it took about like 40 seconds or something. So it was very slow, and its accuracy was just pretty good. When we broke it down into individual steps, each individual step wasn't that complicated. It got complicated because you're trying to do it all at the same time. And so when we broke it into three or four different steps, each of those steps actually did great on Haiku, right? And because they're simpler, they can go on a smaller model. And so now, because instead of doing one large call, we did four small calls, the time went from like 45 seconds to I think about 7 seconds. The cost was like a quarter of the cost, right? And the accuracy went up.
Yeah, I mean that I feel like that speaks for itself in a lot of ways. It just makes so you can use like you can effectively so you can get a better result at a lower cost with a less intelligent model by simply breaking down the task. And then I does the inverse apply too? So like I totally get how this applies to lowering cost, but could it also apply with enhancing accuracy or capability with like a frontier model of say like let's say Sonnet can't do something with my 20,000 token prompt. Is it possible that chopping that up into subtasks could even help you like get more squeeze more juice out of a frontier model like a Sonnet 3.5 or something like that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. There's a couple of kind of like maybe not immediately obvious benefits. So first of all, one of the paradigms that I have is that when you ask a model to do something, it's got like 100 units of reasoning power, right? And every time you're asking it to do something complicated, it uses a bit of that reasoning. And this goes into prompt engineering. When you have a poorly engineered prompt, it needs to use some of its reasoning to figure out what the heck you're talking about, right? And so a poorly engineered prompt, but it's doing something simple, that's okay because you've used a bunch of your reasoning to figure out what to do and then a little bit more to do your task, right? And you'll see this when you have really complicated prompts. Prompt engineering matters a lot because you need all of that reasoning power to go into what you're asking the model to do. You don't have any flex room for poorly engineered prompts. But when you call the model, you get your 100 units of reasoning. If you have a prompt, let's say it's 30,000 tokens, and you break it into 10, 10, 10, even though it's the same cost, you're calling it 3 times. So you're getting 300 units of reasoning instead of 100, right? And if you can think about it on the GPU side, right? You're basically every time you're calling it, you're getting the full strength of that model, all of its weights running against whatever you've sent it, right? And so we certainly see it increasing accuracy because of that. But you were mentioning before the power of adding roles or examples is another really powerful prompt engineering technique. Now you can apply it to each section and increase the accuracy because your rules and results are focused just on that particular task.
Yeah, I
Oh,
mean that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm thinking of it like each time you call the model, you're getting that model's whatever agreement it has to process that data and respond it. And I like your analogy of like let's call it 100 intelligence units or something like that. Each time we call the model, that they are going to use some of that just simply comprehending the prompt and trying to understand what the heck you want it to do. Take that part of the processing away from the model. You process it in your application, you break it down in your application, and then also on top of that, and so already you're breaking up, you're like decomposing it, breaking it up, so you're getting more power on each disparate part. But then when you layer, you got to go back to GenAI 101, and then you layer all of these best practices for prompt engineering on top of that, like adding roles or making it a multi-shot prompt. Yeah, because I'm sure you've even seen people try to do multi-shot Frankenstein prompts, and it's probably so much more effective to do multi-shots like small prompts, or even then I could even just see as somebody who's designing systems after you've broken it down and assuming you have metrics around each prompt to measure accuracy, then you can make those tactical decisions of like, oh well, there's this one part of my workflow that the accuracy isn't good, so let's look at doing a
yeah.
multi-shot prompt on this one part to improve the whole system.
Yeah, and I also like to think about prompts in terms of dead space, right? And so sometimes what can happen is if you have a large prompt, few shot, giving examples of what you want the prompt to do is one of the most powerful techniques that we have for guiding models. But if you have a big prompt and maybe it can do 3 different things depending on what the input is, often that means you have 3 sets of examples. And so now a request comes in and it's for one thing. One set of examples are used. The other 2 sets are dead space. And that means you're paying for that in cost and latency, but also in confusion. Because the more dead space there is, it's like you're introducing chances for your model to misunderstand, right? And so by decomposing it, you pull out all that dead space. It can really help increase your accuracy and cost just from that alone. So I did want to mention another outcome from another part of this decomposition process, which is we were talking earlier about sometimes it can be challenging to ask customers to build gold standard input output sets for evaluation. And one of the fallouts from decomposing is that you don't have a gold standard set for input and output for the whole system only, but for every step as well. And so now I'm not only asking customers to set up 100 test cases, I'm asking to set up 100 test cases for each step in the process, right? So I'm really upping the ante on what I'm asking them to build. But there's a lot of value. So like very common, the first step in a GenAI process is some kind of semantic, right? So it's all the different kinds of inputs, and then the output is just like A, B, C, or D, right? It's just which route do I go on? Which type of question is this? So it can be pretty fast to write out those test cases. But what's super interesting to me is an unexpected benefit I've seen is aligning the team to the scope of the project. So having gone through these exercises a number of times, what happens is that once I've talked to the team into building test cases, inevitably someone will say, well, one input could be what's the cost of pizza? And then someone else on the team will say, "Oh no, that's not what our bot is about." And then they're arguing, "No, no, we need to answer these questions. This is really important, right?" And so this has almost nothing to do with the bot itself or the project itself, but the team's understanding of what the heck they're supposed to be doing. A lot of times that gets aligned on the front side when we build the test set versus like once you've already built the project and then someone puts in what's the pizza and then now we've already built it and it's too late to realize that we weren't even aligned on what we were doing. So that has been a kind of an unexpected but very happy benefit for a lot of teams.
I could totally see that how it would like enhance communication. In fact, you know what's funny? I was talking to a peer about prompt decomposition. We both read your blog and we're kind of geeking out about it. And he was like, "Oh, it kind of reminds me of like a microservices approach to developing applications. Like we've got like a
Absolutely.
monolithic server, and we're going to
Yep.
break it down into smaller parts. And there's all these benefits of that. And by the way, one of the big benefits of a microservices architecture is not just technology; it's organizational benefit. That it
Yep.
legitimately does help build specialized teams or enhance communication and like contracts across teams. Like there's all these other soft benefits to a microservices architecture, and so it kind of makes. Obviously they're not one for one the same, but if I could make an analogy for those engineers or folks that have been working in the field for a while, like that was a kind of light bulb moment for me, like seeing that analogy and loosely connecting some of the benefits of each of those techniques
No,
together.
I think that's a great parallel. Having worked in tech through the microservices revolution, there's many parallels. I think that's actually a pretty good paradigm to think about prompt decomposition that way. It feels like taking apart a monolith sometimes.
So with that, this is the question I really want to get your opinion on, because very few people I think are seeing like have the perspective you have on this. So customers bought in. Customer has a high ROI use case, so much so that they have decided to go down this path of like either optimizing or building out metrics and building out these test cases and decomposing this app that's not that they really want to get into production. Tell me about like because I think most people, or at least most people I know, are very familiar with the experience of like frankly a single engineer building out a proof of concept GenAI app. It's pretty easy in an afternoon, in a week, to sit down and build something, even something relatively sophisticated that has low accuracy or like isn't quite ready for production, but that you can show people. And I'm really curious, like once you about like development velocity in terms of like because I bet there's a curve like with most changes like when I think about microservices at first people it kind of slows teams down for a second while they figure out what's good, why they need to do this, but then once
Hmm.
they adopt it, it actually becomes an accelerator because they understand the model with which it's easier to get things deployed into production and scale them and upgrade them and all that good stuff. Kind of curious what you're seeing in terms of that maybe adoption curve of a technique like this and how long it takes. Because like for me right now, if I went from taking my Frankenstein prompts to decomposing it, at first it would take me a little longer, but I bet eventually I might get used to the workflow and get back to my original speed. But I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of velocity, or maybe it's just setting expectation. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it is the case that you already built a Frankenstein model, often by the time that I'm being called in, they're already stuck. So increasing velocity is pretty easy because if you have any speed at that point, you're doing good. That
Yeah.
said, I think it again kind of parallels microservices in that once you've adopted that mindset of I'm not building the monolith, I'm just going to build my little piece, it absolutely accelerates customers. And part of that is it makes it really easy for more than one person to work on it. Like one of the downfalls of the Frankenstein model is that basically it's one person's model, one person's prompt, and it's very difficult because the prompts are not deterministic and because all of the text in a whole prompt, you change something here and it may change something down there. Even if you try to break it up, like, oh, your team work on the bottom half of the prompt and we'll work on the top half of the prompt, it's a disaster trying to untangle those, right? But once you've broken it down and you say, okay, this task is just to extract these kinds of data, and this task is to check for this type of thing, different people can work on that and you can actually accelerate the development quite a bit. The other place where I see a lot of acceleration is in scope creep. I guess creep makes it sound bad, but adding new features. Many of our customers use a semantic router at the start of these processes, at the start of a decompose process. So the router's job is just whatever the request comes in, what's the next step? What kind of request is this? Look at the request and decide, is it weather? Is it movies? Is it inappropriate? Right? And what happens is now before you had the big thing and then the customer said, well, I really need you to add something that tells me about fashion advice. right? And so you have your big prompt, you add fashion device to the bottom, and it may change everything else's in some unpredictable way. Now you have to run all of your tests again and hope for the best, right? Instead, what you do is you add a single line to your router that says, oh, if it's related to fashion, output in F, because F is our fashion. And now you can build this whole new pipeline of chaining prompts down here that won't impact anything else up here, and it makes it very easy to add new features. So the acceleration of innovation is faster as well. Speaking of acceleration, one of the biggest things that I see for accelerating the development of the systems overall is the cycle time of running the test framework. Right. And so it's very common for customers to have a test framework that says, well, I'm going to tweak a prompt and then I'll throw it over to some users and they'll give me some feedback. And then 2 to 3 days later, I'll see what my new accuracy metric is. Right. And when we shorten that cycle period down to about 5 seconds, like it is in the blog that I mentioned, where you're using an LLM as a judge and you have everything multi-threaded and built into a quick test, now I can tweak my prompts every 5 seconds to get immediate feedback and continue to tweak. So you can feel the change in acceleration when I say, okay, over 3 weeks, one team has made 5 changes, tested 5 changes, and one team has tested 5,000 changes. Like which one of them accelerated their innovation, right? And so I think with decomposition, the nice thing is a lot of those tests are super easy and super
Yep.
fast,
Yeah.
right?
I almost think I think there's almost this fallacy as developer, at least that I've experienced, where when you build a Gen AI, like around productivity, really, it's like when you build a Gen AI app, even if it, even if, and you build it on your own time for some eval, even if it doesn't work half the time, if it works, if it gives you an accurate response half the time, you feel productive still, right? Because you feel like you just built something awesome. But like if it doesn't get to production, right? If you're not actually, you don't have a system or framework to actually launch that thing that you built, like you can feel like a superhero 10x developing all these proof of concepts, but you're not actually being productive. Like what's
Yeah.
productive is building a system to iterate and launch software at scale, which is what we've been doing for centuries. But I feel like anytime we learn a new technology, we're adapting to what that means, and I feel like the expectations are still kind of aligning with the reality of that. I got kind of two quick questions around this topic, mostly just curiosity of what you're seeing customers adopt and then the future. One is around a semantic router, and then one's around like the technique of decomposition. First, like semantic router, like what are customers using for a semantic router? Are they building their own, or is it just another LLM that has some like definition? Like what are you seeing that front door of a semantic router be? Is it an open source project? Like what's out
Yeah.
there that customers are using?
So one of the benefits of prompt decomposition is that for every step along the way, you don't have to use GenAI at
Yeah.
all. And in fact, you shouldn't use GenAI. Anywhere where you cannot use GenAI, don't use GenAI, right? This is the rule of thumb. And so, I was going to mention an example earlier where in the middle of a prompt, a customer was saying, if the number, if a certain number is between like 0 and 5, say slow. If it's between 5 and 15, say okay, and then 15 or higher, say fast. And they just could not. No amount of prompting would get the LLM to understand this range. And the fundamental problem was that was a math problem, and LLMs do language, not math. And so when we decomposed it, that step was a Python, 2 lines of Python. Like it was literally an if then in Python and got a perfect answer, right? And no amount of prompt engineering is going to get your LLM to do math in that way. And so I think the key understanding is for every step, find the right tool. And semantic routers are no different. I would say very, very common at the POC stage when you're doing a lot of just understanding the scope of your project or whatever to use something like Haiku as your semantic router. So it's still an LLM call. The only reason that they're doing that though is because it's very fast. It's very easy to iterate. I can change my prompt and immediately it works differently. I can test it. At scale, you pull out LLMs wherever you can. So even at the semantic router stage, just building using a traditional model to categorize the input into one of those routes can be great. But because then you're actually training a model, you have a little bit more investment. So I would usually wait until you're very comfortable that you have your route set up correctly, and then yeah, you can absolutely use a traditional categorization model.
Makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
I
Um,
do want to warn. I need to put a word of warning
Please,
if I
please.
can. One of the biggest pitfalls that people fall into, and it's hilarious to me because I'm such a hypocrite of this, but um, I talked a bit earlier about how critical and important it is to get the gold standard input-output sets for evaluation, and we do that for every step, and it can be a lot of work. The number one thing that I hear in response is, I'll use GenAI to do that. I'm going to make synthetic testing data. And this is how to ruin your project. This has led to so much heartbreak and tears and face on smashing into keyboards. And I'll tell you a funny story of showing how sneaky this can be. When I wrote the prompt decomposition blog, the main example that I use there is a system that's assigning summer camps to kids. And this was top of mind because I was putting my kids in summer camp at the time, but I needed a data set of like, well, what are the camps that are even available that the LLM is assigning them to? And so I thought, you know what? I know I tell people never to do this, but I'm sure it'll be okay this time. And so I was like, it's got to be innocuous, right? And so I had an LLM tell me, give me 25 summer camp names, right? I wasn't even making, I was like, it's just a summer camp name. It's not a big deal, right? So, I said 25 summer camp names that a kid might want to go to. Astronaut camp, unicorn camp, not math camp. I don't know. But anyway, that was it. That was my sample. That was the only. I made the rest of the sample data. I'm doing my testing, and I get low accuracy for a particular camp. And when I made the test data, I said, okay, here's astronaut camp, and I said, okay, well, it's going to be in July, and it's going to be for 7-year-olds. And then every time it ran through the model, it was putting it in August. And I couldn't figure out what in the world is going on. It's not in my, there's no August anywhere. It's not in my prompt. It's not in the input, nothing. What's going on? And come to find out that somewhere in the training data, there was an astronaut camp that was in August. And so because I'd used that name, it brought in the date hidden inside the model. And the model assumed if you're talking about astronaut camp, it must be in August. And it was causing all kinds of problems. So all I can say is never, ever, ever build your test set with GenAI, put in the time and money and effort, and you will be so much happier to have a real trustworthy.
I love that as a word of wisdom, particularly because that's something I would have actually never thought that synthetic data could have backfired with. And so, yeah, I think that's really great context for folks that are even experienced builders, right? That would think like, I'll take a little shortcut here. That's quite funny. Justin, this has been, I wish we had more time. I have a bunch more questions, but this has been a really refreshing conversation, first of all. So thank you. Thank you for like getting down into the weeds and talking about like what you're seeing in the field and what's working for customers. I think this will help people. And thanks for writing the blog.
Yeah, of
On
course.
top of that, really, I'm a big fan of
Hey,
the technique. I just got to find a customer early enough in the process to set this expectation to where like we can leverage it because I'm tired of seeing use cases not get into production over accuracy because now I have the knowledge that it can be overcome. It's not a. Thanks a
yeah,
lot for coming on and for the
yeah. Thanks for
conversation. It
having me. It
was
was great
great getting to
chatting.
meet you. Awesome. Appreciate it, Justin.